Eric Clapton stopped Cream's rehearsal, pointed at Jimi Hendrix, who'd just walked in, and said in front of the entire band, "This guy plays loud because he can't play clean. Turn off your distortion, Jimi. Let's hear what you really sound like." What Jimi played next left Clapton on his knees, saying, "I was so wrong." It was November 1966, and Eric Clapton was at the absolute peak of his British fame. Cream had just formed, combining Clapton with Jack Bruce and Ginger Baker into what many considered a supergroup. They were rehearsing in a warehouse space in West London, working through arrangements for their debut album. And everywhere Eric went, people painted the same graffiti on walls: "Clapton is God." Eric had earned that reputation through precision and clarity. His playing with John Mayall's Blues Breakers had established him as the cleanest, most technically perfect blues guitarist Britain had ever produced. He played with minimal distortion, letting every note ring clear and pure. His philosophy was simple: if you needed volume and effects to sound good, you probably weren't that good to begin with. Jimi Hendrix had arrived in London just a month earlier, brought over by Chas Chandler from the Animals. The buzz around Jimi was immediate and intense. This American guitarist was doing things with feedback, distortion, and sheer volume that London had never heard before. He was loud, chaotic, revolutionary. And to Eric Clapton, he represented everything wrong with the direction rock guitar was heading. On this particular afternoon, Chas Chandler had brought Jimi to Cream's rehearsal space. Chas and Jack Bruce were friends, and Chas wanted to introduce Jimi to London's established guitar community. Eric had agreed to the visit, though privately he was skeptical. He'd heard the stories about Jimi's volume, about his reliance on effects and distortion. It sounded like gimmickry to Eric, tricks to cover up a lack of fundamental skill. Jimi walked into the rehearsal space wearing a military jacket and a headband, his afro unmistakable, carrying his Stratocaster case. Cream stopped playing, and Chas made the introductions. "Eric, this is Jimi Hendrix. Jimi, Eric Clapton." They shook hands. Eric's grip was firm, assessing. Jimi's was relaxed, confident. "I've heard about you. They say you're quite loud. I play what the music needs. And the music needs a lot of volume and distortion." There was an edge in Eric's voice that made Jack Bruce and Ginger Baker exchange glances. Sometimes it needs to be quiet. Depends on what you're trying to say." Eric set his guitar down and leaned against an amplifier. "See, that's where I think a lot of guitarists are going wrong. They think loud equals powerful. But the real skill, the real artistry, is in playing cleanly, making every note count. Anyone can hide behind distortion. Not everyone can play so cleanly that every mistake is obvious." Jimi walked into the rehearsal space, at Cream's equipment, at the three musicians watching this interaction, at the tension that was building. "You think I hide behind distortion? I think a lot of guitarists do. I don't know you well enough to say if you do, but from what I've heard, you rely pretty heavily on volume and effects."
Jack Bruce tried to intervene. "Eric, maybe—" "No, it's fine," Jimi said quietly. "Eric's making a point. Loud playing can be a crutch. If you can't play clean, you can turn everything up and hope nobody notices your mistakes." "Exactly," Eric said, feeling vindicated. "But," Jimi continued, "the same is true in reverse. Some guitarists play clean because they're afraid to get dirty. They stay in their comfort zone, playing the same blues licks they've always played, never pushing boundaries because pushing boundaries requires risk." The room went silent. Nobody talked to Eric Clapton like that. Not in London. Not when you were a newcomer. Eric's jaw tightened. "Are you suggesting I play it safe?" "I'm suggesting that clean playing and loud playing are both valid if they serve the music. Neither one is superior. They're just different tools." "Well," Eric said, his voice cold now, "let's test that theory. Jack, unplug that practice amp, the one without effects. Jimmy, why don't you plug in and show us what you can do with just a guitar and an amp? No distortion pedals, no wah-wah, no volume games, just clean playing. Let's hear what you really sound like." It was a challenge, issued publicly, in front of Cream and Chaz Chandler. Everyone in the room understood what was happening. Eric was calling Jimmy's bluff, suggesting that without his effects and volume, Jimmy would be exposed as mediocre. Jimmy opened his guitar case, pulled out his Stratocaster, and plugged into the small practice amp. The amp was tiny, maybe 15 watts, designed for bedroom practice, not performance. There was no reverb, no effects loop, no way to add any color to the sound. It was just guitar, cable, amp. "What do you want me to play?" Jimmy asked. "Anything, blues, rock, whatever you think you're good at. Just play it clean, at reasonable volume, and let's hear your actual technique." Jimmy adjusted the amp settings, volume at about 4, tone controls flat. The room was completely quiet except for the hum of the small amplifier. Everyone was watching. This was either going to be an embarrassment or a revelation. Jimmy started playing, and within 30 seconds, everyone in that room knew Eric Clapton had made a terrible mistake. What came out of that tiny practice amp was the most sophisticated, nuanced, technically perfect blues guitar anyone in that room had ever heard. Jimmy's fingers moved across the fretboard with absolute precision, not a single note out of place, not a single sloppy bend. His vibrato was controlled and expressive. His phrasing was impeccable. Every note rang clear and pure. But it wasn't just technical perfection. Jimmy was telling a story with that guitar. He started with classic blues structures that Eric recognized, standard progressions, familiar patterns. But then Jimmy began weaving in jazz voicings that nobody played in rock contexts. He added chromatic runs that sounded wrong for a split second before resolving beautifully. He used silence as powerfully as he used sound, letting notes hang in the air before answering them with the perfect response.
Eric's expression changed from confident to confused to something approaching fear. This wasn't supposed to be happening. Jimmy was supposed to struggle without his effects. He was supposed to be exposed as someone who needed volume to hide his limitations. Instead, Jimmy was playing circles around what Eric could do, all at living room volume, all without a single effect. Jimmy played for about 8 minutes, building from blues into something that touched on jazz, R&B, and sounds that didn't have names yet. His right-hand technique was flawless. He was getting different tones just by where he struck the strings. His left hand was doing things Eric had never seen, using his thumb on the bass strings while his fingers worked the higher strings, creating independence that sounded like 2 guitarists playing. When Jimmy finished, he carefully set his guitar on a stand and looked at Eric. The room was absolutely silent. Eric Clapton, who everyone called God, who was considered the greatest guitarist in Britain, slowly sat down on the floor. Not collapsed, just deliberately sat down like his legs wouldn't hold him anymore. His face had gone pale. "I was so wrong," Eric said quietly. "I was so fucking wrong." Ginger Baker and Jack Bruce looked at each other, stunned. They'd never seen Eric like this, humbled, shaken. "That was the cleanest playing I've ever heard," Eric continued. "Every note perfect, every bend exact. Your technique I don't have words for how good your technique is. And he put his head in his hands, "I just accused you of being loud because you can't play clean. Jesus Christ." Jimmy sat down on the floor across from Eric. "You weren't completely wrong. I do play loud. I do use distortion and effects, but not because I'm hiding anything. I use them because they let me say things that clean playing can't say." "Show me," Eric said, looking up. "Plug into your regular rig. Show me what those effects add." Jimmy moved to Cream's main amplifier stack, plugged in his pedals, and adjusted the volume higher. Then he played the same blues progression he'd just played clean, but this time with his full arsenal of effects. The difference was stunning. Everything that had been sophisticated and subtle when played clean became massive and urgent when played through effects. The distortion added aggression without losing precision. The wah-wah added vocal qualities that made the guitar speak. The volume added physical presence that you could feel in your chest. But here was the crucial thing. The technique was identical. The notes were the same. The phrasing was the same. Jimi had just added color and texture to something that was already perfect. The effects weren't hiding anything. They were amplifying something that was already there. When Jimi stopped, Eric stood up and walked over to him. "I need to apologize. I was arrogant and I was wrong. I've been thinking that clean playing is the only legitimate form of artistry, but what you just showed me is that effects and volume are just additional colors in the palette. They don't replace technique, they enhance it." "And I need to acknowledge something too," Jimi said. "What you said about some guitarists hiding behind volume, that's true. There are players who use distortion to cover up sloppy technique. I'm not one of them, but they exist. Your emphasis on clean playing, on making every note count, that's important. That's the foundation everything else builds on." Jack Bruce, who'd been watching all of this with fascination, spoke up. "So what you're both saying is that clean playing and loud playing both require skill. They're not opposites, they're complementary."
"Yeah," Jimi said. "Clean playing is essential because it teaches you precision. But loud playing is also essential because it teaches you how to control chaos. Both are hard. Both are valuable." Eric picked up his own guitar. "Can you teach me some of what you were doing? Those jazz voicings? That thumb technique?" For the next 3 hours, the rehearsal forgotten, Jimi Hendrix gave Eric Clapton a masterclass in guitar technique. He showed Eric how to use his thumb for bass notes while fingers worked melody, a technique Jimi had adapted from watching bass players. He demonstrated jazz chord voicings that opened up new harmonic possibilities, ninths, 11ths, 13ths, that most rock guitarists never touched. He explained his approach to feedback, how it could be controlled and made musical rather than just noise, how you could position yourself relative to the amplifier to get different frequencies, how you could use the guitar's volume knob and tone controls to sculpt the feedback into melody. Eric watched, fascinated, as Jimi turned what he'd always considered a technical problem, feedback, into an additional voice for the instrument. Jimi showed him how to make the guitar scream without touching the strings, how to create sustain that lasted impossibly long, how to turn what sounded like chaos into something compositional. In return, Eric showed Jimi some of his blues phrasing techniques, the economy he'd learned from studying B.B. King and Freddie King. He demonstrated his approach to vibrato, how a slight variation in speed and width could change the emotional content of a single note. He explained his method for getting maximum emotion from minimum notes, how sometimes the notes you didn't play were more important than the ones you did. Eric showed Jimi how to make silence work as hard as sound, how to let a phrase breathe, how to build tension through restraint rather than just through volume. They traded ideas, challenged each other, pushed each other to try things neither had attempted before. Jack Bruce joined in on bass, and suddenly they were jamming. Jimi's adventurous harmonic sense combining with Eric's blues discipline, creating something neither could have created alone. Ginger Baker, initially skeptical of this American interloper, found himself smiling as he watched two guitar philosophies merge in real time. Ginger Baker later said it was the most incredible musical exchange he'd ever witnessed. Two of the greatest guitarists in the world, teaching each other, learning from each other, with absolutely no ego in the room. Well, no ego after Eric's initial ego got destroyed, but after that, it was pure musical exploration. The impact of that afternoon rippled through both their careers. Eric's playing with Cream became more adventurous, more willing to incorporate volume and effects in ways he'd previously dismissed. Listen to White Room or Crossroads, and you can hear a guitarist who'd learned that loud could be artful, that distortion could be musical. Jimi's playing became more attentive to the clean, quiet moments. On Electric Ladyland, tracks like Little Wing and 1983, A Merman I Should Turn to Be, showed a guitarist who understood that silence and subtlety were just as powerful as volume and aggression. Clapton told an interviewer in 1968, "Meeting Jimi changed my entire philosophy about guitar. I'd been so rigid, thinking there was a right way and a wrong way to play. Jimi showed me that there are infinite ways to play, and they're all valid if you have the technique to back them up. The effects don't make you a great guitarist, but if you're already a great guitarist, effects can help you express things you couldn't express otherwise." Jimi, in a 1969 interview, said, "Eric Clapton taught me to respect the quiet moments. I'd been so focused on being loud and wild that I forgot that sometimes the most powerful thing you can play is almost nothing. Eric's blues playing, every note means something. That discipline, that precision, I needed to learn that." The two of them jammed together several times after that initial meeting, most famously at a club called the Speakeasy, where they traded solos on Killing Floor and left the audience speechless. Musicians who were there said it was like watching two masters speak different dialects of the same language. When Jimi died in 1970, Eric was devastated. He'd lost not just a fellow guitarist, but someone who'd fundamentally changed how he thought about his instrument. At Jimi's funeral, Eric said, "Jimi taught me that being a great guitarist isn't about choosing between clean or loud, effects or no effects. It's about having such strong fundamental technique that you can express anything you need to express, any way you need to express it." The guitar community learned from their exchange. The false dichotomy between pure guitarists who played clean and effects guitarists who used distortion and volume began to break down. Players realized that Clapton and Hendrix had both been right. Technique was fundamental, but expression required all available tools. Today, when guitar players debate clean versus dirty playing, someone always brings up that afternoon in November 1966, when Eric Clapton challenged Jimi Hendrix to prove himself without effects, and Jimi responded by playing the cleanest, most technically perfect blues anyone had heard, and then showed how effects could amplify that perfection rather than hide it. The lesson is simple, but profound. Mastery isn't about rejecting tools. It's about having such strong fundamentals that any tool you pick up becomes an extension of your voice rather than a crutch for your limitations. Eric Clapton called Jimi loud because he thought Jimi was hiding behind volume. Jimi proved that volume wasn't hiding anything. It was revealing something that clean playing alone couldn't express. And in doing so, he taught Eric that the greatest guitarists don't limit themselves to one approach. They master every approach and choose the right one for what they're trying to say. If this story moved you, remember, never assume someone is using a technique as a crutch until you've heard them without it. The greatest artists aren't great because of their tools. They're great because they've mastered the fundamentals so completely that any tool they pick up becomes an extension of their voice rather than a crutch for their limitations. Subscribe for more stories about when legends challenged each other and both emerged better for it.